Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories like this. The day she locked her own son in the breeding shed, even the crickets fell silent. Georgia, 1847. Beneath the suffocating heat of a late summer sun, the air hung thick with magnolia, blossoms and something darker, desperation wrapped in silk, on the sprawling grounds of Willowbrook Plantation. Nestled deep in the red clay heart of the South, lived Eleanor Whitmore, a widow of 38, porcelain-skinned and steel-eyed, whose grief had curdled into something monstrous. Her husband, Charles Whitmore, had died 2 years prior from a fever that swept through the county like divine retribution. Left with mounting debts, dwindling cotton yields, and a reputation to uphold, Eleanor made a choice that would stain her soul forever. She would not sell the plantation. She would preserve it by any means necessary. And so, in the dead of night, she began what neighbors only whispered about in hushed tones, a private breeding program, not with hired studs or neighboring slaves, but with her own flesh and blood. Her eldest son, Thomas, just 17, broad-shouldered and gentle, had once played the fiddle under the stars for the enslaved children who dared to laugh in secret, but now he was confined to a small, windowless cabin behind the main house, its door reinforced with iron, its walls lined with straw and shame. Inside, young women, some barely older than girls, were brought to him, their eyes hollow, their hands trembling. Eleanor told herself it was survival. Better they bear strong children here than be sold to worse fates. She'd murmur to her reflection each morning, adjusting her lace collar as if it could strangle the truth. But Thomas knew. He'd weep silently after each forced coupling, his knuckles raw from pounding the walls. "Mama," he'd pleaded once, voice cracking like dry timber. "I'd rather die than do this again." She'd only smoothed his hair and whispered, "You'll thank me when you inherit this land." One evening, as fireflies blinked like fallen stars, a new girl was led to the shed, Lila, 16, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a spirit that refused to break. She'd been born on Willowbrook, raised in the shadow of the big house, taught to read by Eleanor herself before the widow changed her mind and burned every book. When Lila saw Thomas inside the shed, she didn't flinch. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "I know what she's making you do, but I won't let her win." Thomas stared, stunned. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not as a monster, but as a man. Outside, Eleanor watched from the porch, her fan still, her breath held. Something was about to change. The night Lila refused to kneel, the stars themselves seemed to lean closer in witness. Thomas sat on the rough-hewn bench, elbows on his knees, head bowed like a condemned man. The air in the shed was thick with sweat, fear, and the sour tang of despair. But Lila stood near the door, arms crossed, her bare feet planted firmly on the dirt floor, as if she'd grown roots right there. "You don't have to do this," she said, voice low but steady. "She can't make you if you say no." Thomas let out a broken laugh. "You think I haven't tried? She'll sell you, or worse, sell your mama, your little brother. You know she will." Lila's jaw tightened. She did know. Last spring, Eleanor had sold old Ben after he'd questioned why the corn rations were cut. Ben's daughter, just 10, had screamed so loud the hounds barked for hours. But Lila had a secret, one she'd carried like a stone in her chest for months. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm already with child." Thomas froze. "What?" "From last month, from before she locked you in here." Lila's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "It's yours, and I won't let her take him or make you do this again." A tremor ran through Thomas. He hadn't known. He'd been so lost in his own shame, he hadn't even noticed the way. She'd held her stomach when passing him water through the slats. Outside, a twig snapped. They both stiffened. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by moonlight, a riding crop dangling from her gloved hand. Her face was unreadable, calm, almost serene, but her eyes burned with cold fire. "So," she said, voice smooth as aged bourbon, "you've been conspiring." Lila didn't flinch. "I'm carrying your grandchild, Miss Eleanor, and I swear on my mama's grave, I'll run before I let you turn him into another ledger entry." For the first time in years, Eleanor hesitated, not out of mercy, but calculation. A child born of Thomas and Lila would be strong, light-skinned, valuable. But rebellion? That was a weed that spread fast. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. "You think I'm cruel?" she said, turning to Thomas. "But this world is crueler. Without this land, without this name, you're nothing. And they," she gestured toward Lila, "are less than nothing." Thomas stood slowly, his voice raw. "Then let us be nothing together." Eleanor's hand twitched. The riding crop rose slightly, but not to strike. Instead, she placed it on the table between them like a gauntlet. "Very well," she said. "But if you defy me, I'll sell every soul on this plantation by dawn." Starting with Lila's brother, silence swallowed the room. Lila's breath hitched. Thomas's fists clenched, and in that moment, a plan began to form. Not of surrender, but of escape. The next morning, the plantation woke to a different kind of silence, one thick with unspoken rebellion. Lila moved through the kitchen yard with deliberate calm, grinding cornmeal as if her hands weren't trembling. But beneath her apron she clutched a folded scrap of paper Thomas had slipped her the night before. A crude map of the woods beyond. Willowbrook, marked with a single X near the Chattahoochee River. It was their only hope. Thomas, confined again to the breeding shed under Eleanor's watchful eye, had spent the night carving a message into the floorboard with a rusted nail. "Midnight River, wait for me." But Eleanor wasn't idle. She'd summoned the overseer, Mr. Hargrove, a man with a face like cracked leather and a reputation for breaking spirits before bones. Over breakfast of grits and bitter coffee, she gave him new orders: double the patrols, and if you see Lila near the tree line, bring her to me. Alive. Hargrove nodded, but his eyes lingered on Eleanor a beat too long. He knew something was shifting. The mistress had always been cold, but now she moved like a panther circling wounded prey. Meanwhile, in the slave quarters, whispers spread like wildfire. Old Maud, who'd nursed Eleanor as a babe and now tended the sick, pulled Lila aside behind the smokehouse. "Child," she rasped, pressing a small pouch into her palm. "This is graveyard dirt and honeycomb, for protection. And for the baby." Lila blinked back tears. "Thank you, Maud." "You carry more than a child," the old woman said, eyes sharp. "You carry the chance to break this curse." By afternoon, the sky turned bruised with clouds. A storm was coming, not just of rain, but reckoning. That evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Thomas found a way to slip the lock. He'd spent weeks loosening the hinge with spit and patience. When the guard changed shift, he crawled through the gap beneath the door, heart hammering like a war drum. He ran, not toward the river yet, but to the stables, where Eleanor kept her prized mare, Juniper. If they were to escape, they'd need speed. But as he reached for the bridle, a voice cut through the dark. "I knew you'd come here." Eleanor stood in the stable doorway, lantern in hand, rain beginning to patter on her bonnet. She wasn't angry. She looked tired. "You think I wanted this?" she asked, voice softer than he'd ever heard. "Your father left us with nothing but debts and pride." "I did what I had to." Thomas stepped forward, mud on his knees. "Then let us go. Please, Mama, let us be free." For a heartbeat, she wavered. The lantern light flickered across her face, showing not a monster, but a woman hollowed by fear. Then she straightened. "Freedom is a luxury we can't afford." Behind her, Hargrove emerged from the rain, shotgun in hand. Thomas's breath caught. The river was still 2 miles away, and midnight was coming. Rain slashed through the trees like whips as Thomas backed into the hayloft. his pulse roaring in his ears. Hargrove's boots crunched on wet straw below. "Come on down, boy. Ain't no use running." But Thomas wasn't thinking of himself anymore. He thought of Lila, waiting by the river with his child growing inside her. He thought of the map, the midnight promise, the fragile dream of a life where his son wouldn't be born into chains, especially not chains forged by his own blood. He spotted it then, the loose board near the loft's edge, the one he and his brother used to sneak out as boys. With a desperate heave, he pried it open just enough to slip through, landing hard in the mud behind the smokehouse. He ran, not toward the river, not yet, but to the quarters. He had to warn Lila. If Hargrove was already hunting him, Eleanor would send men to the riverbank. They'd be walking into a trap. Lila saw him coming through the cracked window of her cabin. She'd been pacing, one hand on her belly, the other clutching Maud's charm, when Thomas burst in, soaked and breathless. She didn't speak, just handed him a satchel of dried yams, a canteen and a knife wrapped in burlap. "They're waiting for us at the river," he gasped. Her eyes narrowed. "Then we go another way." She led him through the cornfield, then into the overgrown thicket behind the old burying ground, where enslaved ancestors lay in unmarked graves, their names lost, but their presence thick in the air. Lila moved like a shadow, sure-footed despite the storm. Behind them, dogs began to howl. "They've set the hounds," Thomas whispered. "We're not going north," Lila said suddenly, stopping beneath a lightning-split oak. "We're going south, to Macon. There's a free black preacher there, Reverend Isaiah Cole. He helps folks cross into Georgia's underground roots." Thomas stared. "You knew this all along?" "I've been planning since I found out I was with child," she said, voice fierce. "I wasn't waiting for you to save me. I was waiting for you to choose." Before he could respond, a gunshot cracked through the trees. They dropped low. Through the rain, they saw Hargrove and two others with lanterns, fanning out near the riverbank, just as Lila predicted. "We go now," she said, grabbing his hand. They moved like ghosts through the storm, following the creek bed to mask their scent from the dogs. Hours passed. Dawn threatened at the horizon, just as they reached the edge of Willowbrook's land. A figure stepped from the trees. It was Maud. She held a bundle in her arms, 2 blankets, a loaf of bread, and a small wooden flute Thomas had carved as a boy. "The mistress thinks you're at the river," Maud said, pressing the bundle into his hands. "She don't know about the preacher, but she's sending riders to every crossroad by sunrise." Thomas hugged her tightly. "Thank you, Maud." The old woman cupped his face. "You protect that child, and you tell him his people were never broken, just bent." As they disappeared into the mist, Maud turned back toward the plantation, her shoulders straight, her heart heavy with hope. But back at Willowbrook, Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the eastern sky bleed gold. She hadn't sent riders to the crossroads. She'd sent them to Macon 3 days later. Thomas and Lila crouched in the root cellar of a burned-out barn 10 miles outside Macon, their clothes stiff with mud and exhaustion. The journey had been a gauntlet of near misses, hounds baying in the distance, patrols at every ferry crossing, and once, a white farmer who eyed Lila's swollen belly with suspicion before. Thomas spun a tale about them being indentured servants, fleeing a cruel master. The man had given them bread, and watched them ride off on a borrowed mule with narrowed eyes. Now shivering in the damp dark, Lila pressed a hand to her stomach. "He kicked again," she whispered, a rare smile touching her lips. Thomas squeezed her shoulder, but his eyes were distant. "We should have reached Reverend Cole's by now. Something's wrong." Indeed, Macon wasn't the sanctuary they'd hoped for. The town buzzed with tension, posters bearing crude sketches of them. Runaways, dangerous reward 300, were nailed to every post. Worse, whispers said slave catchers from Savannah had arrived, hired by a wealthy widow from upstate. Eleanor. She hadn't just sent riders, she'd hired professionals. That night, under a moon veiled by clouds. They finally found the address. Maud had scribbled on a scrap of cloth, 47 Elm Street, behind the red shutters, but the house was empty. Furniture overturned, Bible pages scattered like fallen leaves, and on the wall above the hearth, a single word carved in haste. Gone. Panic clawed at Thomas's throat. Where would he go? Lila knelt, sifting through ashes in the fireplace. Her fingers found a half-burned note. She smoothed it carefully. Safe house compromised. Head to Stone Creek Church. Midnight. Knock twice, then once. Trust no one. Hope flickered. But so did fear. Stone Creek was another 12 miles, and they had less than 6 hours. They set out at once, sticking to creek beds and abandoned rail lines. But as they neared the church, a humble clapboard, building nestled in a pine grove, they saw smoke curling from its steeple. Not cooking smoke, burning smoke. Men on horseback circled the grounds, their voices sharp in the night. One held a torch, another a coiled rope. Thomas pulled Lila behind a thicket. It's a trap. She nodded, breath shallow. But maybe the Reverend's inside. Before he could stop her, she slipped from his grasp and crept toward the church's side window. Through a crack in the warped wood, she saw him, Reverend Cole, bound to a pew, blood streaking his temple but alive, and standing over him, elegant even in the chaos, was Eleanor Whitmore. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood a man in a tailored coat, Sheriff Collier of Bibb County. "You've caused quite the stir, Eleanor," the sheriff drawled. "But we've got them cornered now." Eleanor's voice was ice. "I want them alive, especially the girl." Lila's blood ran cold. They weren't just hunting runaways. They were hunting an air. Lila's breath fogged in the cold air as she pressed herself against the rough church siding, her mind racing faster than her heart. Inside, Eleanor paced like a caged lioness. "That child is Whitmore blood," she hissed to the sheriff. "It belongs on my land, under my name, not lost to some fugitive fantasy." Sheriff Collier tipped his hat. "Don't worry, ma'am. My men have the woods surrounded. They'll be here by dawn, or dead in the brush." Lila slipped back to Thomas, her voice a thread of sound. "She's not just after us. She wants the baby." Thomas's face hardened. "Then we don't go in. We draw them out." He remembered the old hunting trick his father taught him. Fire in the east, noise in the west, create confusion, then strike where they least expect. They crept to the far side of the churchyard, where dry brush met pine needles. Thomas struck flint to steel. A small flame leapt to life. He fed it carefully, then tossed it into a pile of tinder near the sheriff's horses. Seconds later, chaos erupted. The horses reared, snapping their tethers. Men shouted. Torches swung wildly in the confusion. Thomas and Lila darted toward the church's back door, but it was barred from the inside. "Reverend?" Lila hissed through a crack. "It's us." Inside, Reverend Cole lifted his head. With a grunt, he kicked the leg of a broken pew toward the door. It wasn't much, but it created a gap. Thomas jammed the knife into the latch, prying it loose. The door groaned open. They dragged the Reverend into the night, just as a rider spotted them. "There," he bellowed. Gunfire split the air. They ran, not toward the road, but into the cemetery behind the church, weaving between moss-draped headstones. Bullets kicked up dirt at their heels. Reverend Cole stumbled, clutching his side. "Go on," he gasped. "I'll slow them down." "No," Lila said firmly, looping his arm over her shoulder. "We go together." But then, from the tree line, a voice cut through the dark, calm, commanding, chillingly familiar. "Thomas, Lila, stop this foolishness." Eleanor stood beneath a gnarled oak, lantern in hand, her dress pristine despite the mud and blood around her. She looked almost maternal. "I've arranged everything," she said, stepping closer. "You'll come back. The child will be raised as a Whitmore, educated, respected. No one need ever know the truth." Thomas stepped in front of Lila. "You mean no one need know you bred your Own son like livestock? Eleanor's mask cracked. I saved this family. I preserved our name and destroyed your soul. Thomas shot back. A long silence fell, broken only by the wind through the pines. Then Eleanor raised her hand. From the shadows, 6 armed men emerged, rifles aimed. But before she could speak, a new sound echoed through the graveyard. Hoofbeats, dozens of them. From the ridge above, a line of riders appeared. Black men and women on horseback, faces set with resolve. At their lead was Maud, riding tall on Eleanor's own mare, Juniper, a shotgun across her lap. You forgot one thing, Miss Eleanor, Maud called down, voice ringing like church bells. This child ain't yours to claim. Eleanor's eyes widened in disbelief. The underground hadn't just sent help. It had declared war. The standoff in the graveyard hung like a held breath. Moonlight glinting off. Rifle barrels, wind rustling through the oaks, and Maud's voice still echoing in the silence. Eleanor's composure shattered. You stole my horse, she cried, pointing at Juniper. Maud didn't flinch. This horse carried your son to his shame. Now she carries us to freedom. Sheriff Collier raised his pistol. You're all under arrest, interfering with lawful property retrieval. One of Maud's riders, a tall man, with a scar across his cheek, spoke without moving, his lips much. Ain't no law that says a child is property, especially not God's child. Thomas stepped forward, shielding Lila and Reverend Cole. We're not going back, Mama, not ever. Eleanor's face twisted, not with rage, but with something deeper. Fear. She'd built her world on control, on bloodlines, on the illusion that power could protect her from ruin. But here, in this sacred ground of the dead, her empire was crumbling. Then you'll die here, she whispered. She nodded to Hargrove. He raised his rifle. But before he could fire, Maud's shotgun boomed. Hargrove dropped, clutching his shoulder, howling in pain. Chaos erupted. Riders charged. Gunfire cracked. Thomas grabbed Lila's hand and pulled her toward the woods. Reverend Cole limping behind them. Go, Maud shouted. We'll hold them. They ran through the pines, branches whipping their faces, the sounds of battle fading behind them. By dawn, they reached a hidden ravine where a covered wagon waited, driven by a woman with kind eyes and a scarred knuckle. Name's Ruth, she said, helping Lila inside. I'll take you to Savannah. From there, a ship sails for Boston tonight. Thomas hesitated. What about Maud? The others? Ruth's voice softened. They knew the risk. Now go before the sun shows your tracks. As the wagon rolled east, Lila leaned against Thomas, exhausted, but alive. For the first time in months, she felt hope. Not just for escape, but for a future. But back at the graveyard, Eleanor stood alone amid the chaos. Her men were disarmed. Hargrove groaned in the dirt. The sheriff had fled. Maud approached, dismounting slowly. You could have been different, she said. Not with anger, but sorrow. Your husband was cruel, yes, but you chose this. Eleanor looked at her hands. Soft, clean, stained only by ink and tea. I had no choice. You always had a choice, Maud replied. You just chose power over love. She turned and walked away, leading Juniper by the reins. Eleanor collapsed to her knees in the mud, the weight of her sins finally crushing her. But miles away, in the belly of a swaying wagon, Lila placed a hand on her stomach and whispered, You're free, little one. Before you're even born, you're free. Yet as the sun rose over Georgia, a new rider galloped south, not toward Savannah, but toward the coast. Eleanor hadn't given up. She'd hired a ship of her own. The salt air of Savannah stung Lila's eyes as she and Thomas slipped through the alleyways behind River Street, their clothes exchanged for sailors' rags, their faces smudged with soot to hide their features. Reverend Cole, weakened but resolute, had secured passage on the Morning Star. Merchant vessel bound for Boston, with a captain, known to ferry fugitives, north for the right price. The deal was sealed with Maud's last gold coin and a promise. If they made it, they'd send word to the network. But as they neared the docks, Thomas froze. At the end of the wharf, standing beside a sleek black schooner flying no flag, was Eleanor. She wore a traveling cloak, her hair pinned tight, her gloved hands clasped as if she were waiting for a carriage, not hunting runaways. Behind her stood two men in dark coats, mercenaries, not plantation hands. "She followed us," Lila whispered, pulling Thomas into the shadow of a fishmonger's stall. Thomas's jaw tightened. "She won't let us leave Georgia." They ducked into a tavern stinking of rum and sweat, where Ruth met them in a back booth. "Change of plans," she said, voice low. "The Morning Star's been delayed. Customs inspection. Could be hours." Lila's stomach dropped. Hours they didn't have. "We need another ship," Thomas said. Ruth shook her head. "Every captain within 50 miles knows your faces now. She's offering $1,000 for your return." $1,000. Enough to buy 10 plantations. Despair crept in, until a voice spoke from the booth behind them. "You ain't got money, but you got something better." An old black sailor with one eye and a silver earring leaned forward, his breath smelling of cloves. "I'm Captain Elias. My ship, the Liberty, sails with the tide in 1 hour, heading to Nova Scotia." Thomas frowned. "Why help us?" Captain Elias tapped his chest. "My daughter was sold out of Charleston when she was 12. Never saw her again. If I can keep that from happening to another child." He glanced at Lila's belly. "I'll take you, but you work your passage, and you stay hidden below deck, no matter what." They agreed. As night fell, they boarded the Liberty through a smuggler's hatch, crawling into the cramped hold among barrels of salted pork and crates of nails. The ship groaned as it pulled from the dock, but as they cleared the harbor, Lila heard it. The sharp report of a cannon. She scrambled to a porthole. Eleanor's schooner was giving chase, its black sails billowing like wings of a crow. "She's not letting us go," Thomas said, gripping the hull. Captain Elias appeared at the hatch, face grim. "She's got a faster ship, and a bigger gun." Lila clutched her stomach. "What do we do?" The old captain's one eye gleamed. "We don't outrun her. We outthink her." He turned and barked orders to his crew. Above deck, sails shifted. The Liberty veered hard east, toward the treacherous shoals of Tybee Island. Eleanor's ship followed, confident in its speed, but Captain Elias knew these waters like his own heartbeat, and as the moon rose over the Atlantic, he steered them straight into a labyrinth of hidden sandbars and riptides, where only a local would dare sail. The chase was on, and the sea itself would decide who was worthy of freedom. The Liberty sliced through the black water like a blade, its timbers groaning under the strain as Captain Elias barked commands in a language half English, half Gullah. "Hard to starboard. Trim the mainsail now!" Thomas clung to a barrel as the ship heeled violently, seawater sloshing over the deck above. Lila, curled in a hammock lashed to the hull, pressed a hand to her belly, whispering prayers in a voice too soft for fear to hear. Behind them, Eleanor's schooner, the Vengeance, its name freshly painted in blood red, letters cut through the waves with terrifying speed. A second cannon blast lit the night, the ball whistling just over the Liberty's stern. "She's gaining," shouted a crewman from above. Captain Elias didn't flinch. "Let her." He turned the wheel sharply, steering straight for a jagged line of rocks known as Devil's Teeth, so named because no ship that touched them ever sailed again. Eleanor, standing at the bow of the Vengeance, screamed orders. Don't let them reach the shoals, but it was too late. The Liberty skimmed the edge of the reef, its keel scraping coral with a sound like bones breaking. Then, miraculously, it slipped into a narrow channel, hidden by mist and moon shadow. The Vengeance wasn't so lucky. With a sickening crack, its hull struck a submerged rock. The mast splintered. Men tumbled into the churning sea. From the porthole, Lila watched as Eleanor clung to the railing, her fine cloak whipping in the wind. her face a mask of disbelief. She wasn't shouting for help. She was screaming Thomas's name. "Thomas, come back. You're my son." Thomas turned away, tears mixing with salt spray. "I was never your son," he whispered. "Not like this." The Liberty surged forward, leaving the wreckage behind. By dawn, they were far out to sea, the Georgia coast a smudge on the horizon. Lila finally slept, her head resting on Thomas's shoulder. He stroked her hair, watching the sun rise over endless water that meant freedom, not chains. But Captain Elias found him on deck, his face grim. "We're not safe yet," he said, nodding toward the western sky. "Storm's coming. And your woman? She's in labor." Thomas's blood ran cold. "Now?" The captain nodded. "The sea shakes loose what the land holds tight." Below deck, Lila was already gripping the ropes tied to the hammock, sweat beading on her brow. "It's time," she gasped. As thunder rolled in the distance, Thomas held her hand, whispering promises he prayed he could keep. Hours later, as lightning split the sky, a cry pierced the storm, not of pain, but of life. A boy, small, strong, and free. They wrapped him in a sailcloth blanket and named him Elijah. "Yahweh is my God." But as the storm raged, Captain Elias stared at the compass, his face pale. "The current's pulling us back," he muttered, "toward Georgia and far behind, through the rain and ruin." A single lifeboat drifted, carrying a woman with nothing left but vengeance, and a will that refused to drown. The storm raged for 3 days. Rain lashed the Liberty like divine punishment, waves swallowing the deck whole, ropes snapping like gunshots in the wind. Below, Lila clung to newborn Elijah, her body weak but her spirit unbroken. Thomas never left her side, feeding her sips of broth, singing the old fiddle tunes his father once played. Songs now stripped of pain, reborn as lullabies, but Captain Elias knew the truth. They were lost. The storm had thrown them off course. The compass spun wildly, and worse, the fresh water was running low. On the 4th morning, the clouds broke. Sunlight flooded the deck, blinding and golden. The crew cheered until they saw it. Land, but not Nova Scotia, not even the Carolinas, the red clay bluffs of Georgia. They'd circled back. Panic spread like fire. "She'll be waiting," one sailor muttered. "That widow don't quit." Thomas stood at the bow, Elijah swaddled against his chest. He looked at the shore, his childhood home, his prison, his shame, and then at his son's face, peaceful in sleep. "No," he said, voice firm. "We don't go ashore." Captain Elias approached, his one eye weary. "We've got no choice. The baby needs clean water. Lila needs rest." Thomas shook his head. "If we land, she'll take him. She'll say he's a Whitmore heir. And the law? The law will agree." Just then, a lookout shouted from the crow's nest. "Sail to the east. Single mast. Small vessel." They all turned. Drifting toward them, battered but afloat, was Eleanor's lifeboat. She stood at its center, drenched but upright, her dress torn, her hair wild. In her hands, she held not a weapon, but a white flag. "She's surrendering?" Ruth asked, disbelief in her voice. Thomas narrowed his eyes, or setting a trap. But as the lifeboat drew closer, Eleanor dropped to her knees in the bow. "I only want to see him," she called, voice raw. "Just once, then I'll let you go." Silence fell over the Liberty. Lila appeared on deck, wrapped in a shawl, Elijah in her arms. She looked at Eleanor, not with hatred, but with pity. "You think seeing him will heal you?" Lila asked. "It won't. Only letting go will." Eleanor's shoulders shook. "He's my blood." "He's ours," Thomas said firmly. "And he'll never know the things you made us do." Eleanor looked at her son, at the man he'd become despite her, and something in her broke. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Take this," she said, tossing it onto the Liberty's deck. "It's the deed to Willowbrook, and a letter of manumission for every soul still there." Thomas stared. "Why?" Because I finally understand, she whispered. Blood doesn't make a family. Love does. She turned her lifeboat toward the open sea. Go north, she called over her shoulder, and never look back. As the Liberty sailed away, Eleanor drifted alone into the horizon, no longer a mistress, no longer a monster, just a woman finally facing the cost of her choices. Weeks later in Boston, Thomas and Lila stood on free soil, Elijah laughing in the autumn sun, and though the past would always whisper, their future, finally, was their own. Thank you for reading till the end. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.